Have you ever stopped to think that a single decision can change a person's life forever? And what if that decision is made by someone who has no idea who they are really affecting? The story you're about to hear begins with a mistake so fatal that no one ever imagined what happened next. In a small town where everyone knows each other and secrets don't seem to exist, a policeman did something unthinkable. He thought he was just doing his job, but what he didn't know was that that moment of anger would change everything for him and for a young girl called Sarah. But that wasn't the end of it. This policeman would soon discover that, in fact, he had just awakened something far greater than he could ever have imagined. Sarah has always been a different child, not because of her appearance or her physical limitations, but because of her silent strength. At the age of 7, she had cerebral palsy, and this affected every aspect of her life, from the simplest gestures, such as walking, to something that seemed trivial to many children, playing in the park. But Sarah didn't let her difficulties get the better of her. She had a smile that would brighten up any room, and although she was dependent on her wheelchair, she was always willing to fight day after day against the challenges that life threw at her. Her relationship with her father, Mark, meant everything to her. Mark was the kind of father who did everything possible to ensure that his daughter had as normal a childhood as possible. He always took her to the park, helping her to swing, to make new friends, to explore the world in a way that she could understand. Mark's life wasn't easy, but he found joy in the little moments with Sarah, his reason for living. However, he held a heavy secret. Mark was not only a devoted father, but also an FBI agent. His profession required him to lead a double life, never revealing his true occupation to anyone, least of all his daughter. His life was surrounded by mystery and constant risk. When he wasn't looking after Sarah, he was facing life and death situations, dealing with dangerous criminals, sensitive investigations, and threats to national security. It was an existence full of tension and constant change. But he never allowed this to interfere with his relationship with his daughter. Sarah knew that her father had an important job, but she didn't understand the details. To her, he was just the hero who made her feel safe and loved. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, where the routine was marked by trips to the playground, movie afternoons at home, and the stories Mark told her before bed. Nothing suggested that behind his simple life, Mark was facing something much bigger, more complex, and perhaps more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The tragedy began on a seemingly ordinary afternoon when the sun shone brightly in the sky and the sound of children running through the park filled the air. Sarah, with her adapted wheelchair, was near the swing, trying to reach the sky with a radiant smile. She was in no hurry. She didn't care about the weather. She just wanted to feel the wind on her face and the sense of freedom, something her disability couldn't take away from her. Mark was sitting on a bench nearby, watching his daughter with a protective gaze, but at the same time with a lightness in his heart. He knew that as long as he was there, nothing could harm Sarah. The park's security, the constant vigilance on his part, everything seemed under control. But that day, something went completely out of place. Policeman Tom, a man in his 30s, was making his usual rounds in the neighborhood. He was known for being strict and often for his impersonal and even arrogant attitude. He wasn't a policeman who cared about the stories or faces of the people who crossed his path. His job was simple: patrol, find, and maintain order, regardless of who was in front of him. There was no room for empathy or understanding in his behavior. For him, everything was black and white. Either you were right or you were wrong. He saw Sarah trying to swing and immediately misinterpreted the scenario. Tom understood nothing about the life of a disabled child. He didn't know that Sarah's every movement required effort, that she couldn't do everything herself, that her wheelchair wasn't a mere accessory, but a fundamental part of her existence. The policeman thought that Sarah was blocking the passage of other pedestrians, and something inside him flared up. He didn't want to waste time explaining or asking. He had already decided that she was causing problems. He approached abruptly and, without even bothering to find out what was going on, pushed Sarah's wheelchair hard to push her away, as if he were dealing with an obstacle of some kind. Sarah's reaction was immediate. Her frail body was thrown backwards, and she fell out of the wheelchair with a cry of pain. The sound of her body hitting the floor was shrill, as if all the pain in the world was being felt at that moment. Mark, on seeing the scene, ran towards his daughter, his heart racing, anger and fear mixed in his chest. He shouted Sarah's name, but the pain and shock were so great that he couldn't move with the speed his daughter needed. When he finally reached her, he saw the impact of the fall, the pain on her face, and the disbelief in her eyes. The policeman, realizing what he had done, stood still for a moment, as if time had stopped for him. He couldn't understand what he had done, and regret didn't seem to come quickly enough. Sarah was lying on the floor, her face pale, trying to get up, but without the strength to do so. It was a terrifying scene, and the situation was about to get worse. Mark, who spent his days confronting criminals and dangerous enemies in his work, now found himself facing a completely different dilemma. He didn't know who was angrier, the policeman or himself, for not realizing what was about to happen. Anger was consuming his body, but he knew he had to control himself. He needed to act rationally, not with the impulsiveness that was overwhelming him. As he tried to help his daughter get back on her feet, one question resounded in his mind. How could the policeman have done this? How could he have been so insensitive, so foolish? Mark knew that this wasn't just an error of judgment, but a violation of something much deeper. And he wasn't willing to let it go unpunished. What the policeman didn't know was that, in that moment, he had touched something much bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just dealing with a disabled girl. He was dealing with the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country. Mark couldn't take his eyes off Sarah. Her breathing was rapid, and the despair of seeing her lying on the ground seemed to paralyze her body. She had her hands on the floor, trying to pull herself together, but the impact of the fall had left her in a state of shock. The pain in her frail body was evident, but Sarah's gaze was more concerned with the situation around her than with the pain she was feeling. She looked at the policeman, then at Mark, her eyes watering. Sarah didn't want anyone to fight over her. She had always considered herself capable, independent, and never wanted to be seen as a victim. But what Officer Tom didn't know was that he had made a mistake that could cost him more than he ever imagined. Mark approached Sarah, took her hand gently, and helped her up, trying to calm her down. The pain he felt seeing his daughter in that state could not be described in words. But at the same time, a feeling of immense anger began to grow inside him, something he had never experienced with such intensity. Tom, realizing the gravity of what he had done, felt disconcerted. He took a step forward, but then retreated, hesitating. He knew the situation was out of control, but he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to take back the mistake he had just made. When he tried to approach him to apologize, Mark cut him off with an icy stare. He wasn't interested in empty words or meaningless apologies. The damage had already been done. Sarah, still struggling to breathe, looked at Mark. She knew her father and knew when he was about to lose control. She had seen him deal with difficult situations at work, with criminals, with death threats. But never in her entire life had she seen him so furious, so out of control. And what hurt her even more was the fact that, despite everything, she didn't want her father to do anything that would put him at risk. She loved him too much to see his life destroyed because of someone who, deep down, perhaps didn't even know what he had done. Mark looked at the policeman, his chest tightening with anger. The policeman's gaze was empty, without remorse, as if he didn't really understand the gravity of his action. But Mark knew exactly what to do. He wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. He knew that, as an FBI agent, he had the power to make sure the truth was heard, no matter what it took. With a voice that was calm but carried a quiet menace, Mark approached Tom and said, You have no idea who you've just touched." These words seemed to hang heavy in the air, and the policeman, now aware of the mistake he had made, cringed slightly. Fear began to creep into his chest, but he tried to disguise it. The policeman didn't know that Mark, as well as being an FBI agent, also had contacts in places he could never have imagined. There was much more behind who he was than the simple image of a father worried about his daughter. Mark knew that the first thing he needed to do was to make sure that Sarah was okay. He helped her to stand up completely, supporting her against his chest. He could feel the tension in her body, but he couldn't show weakness, not now. He needed to act with precision, like a trained agent. But something inside him was breaking. He looked at Tom one last time, and in his eyes, there was a silent fury, a promise that this would not go unanswered. Tom, with sweaty hands, tried to understand what was happening. He knew he had made a mistake, but he didn't know who he was up against. He found himself in an uncomfortable position, not knowing how to deal with the situation. The simple fact that Mark was a father concerned about his daughter was not something he had taken seriously until that moment. Now he was beginning to understand that the man in front of him was not just an ordinary father. He was someone much more dangerous, someone who had the power to turn the tables. The tension in the air was thick. Mark was no longer worried about the consequences of what he would do next. He knew that this was bigger than him, bigger than any prosecution or investigation. He was about to confront a system that often left people like Sarah and himself in the background, but now he had a personal reason to act. The policeman was about to discover what it means to cross the line with someone who has the ability to do justice, and not in the ordinary way. From that moment on, the rules changed. What seemed like an isolated incident in the park would soon turn into something much bigger. Mark knew that, as long as he was by his daughter's side, there was nothing and no one who could stop him. The FBI wasn't just a job for him. It was his life, and he was willing to use every resource available to ensure that his daughter received the justice she deserved. But Officer Tom, in his ignorance, didn't understand any of this. He didn't know that his story had just changed forever. He was about to understand that when you challenge someone who has the power to deliver ruthless justice, the consequences can be devastating. And he wasn't prepared for what was to come. The mistake had been made. The game was just beginning. Mark's office was quiet, except for the sound of the phone ringing incessantly. He was sitting in a leather chair, his hand firmly gripping the phone, while he looked at the file on his desk. It was a simple file at first glance, but for him, it represented a chance to turn his anger and pain into something concrete. Officer Tom had made a mistake that would cost him far more than he could have imagined. On the opposite side of the table, Sarah was sitting, her eyes fixed on her father, watching him carefully, as if trying to understand what he was about to do. She knew her father better than anyone. She knew that he would never make a rash move. But there was nothing impulsive about what he was about to do. It was a calculated response, a meticulously planned action, because Mark knew that he was now in a position where he needed to set an example, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had been silenced by injustices like this. Mark stood up suddenly and walked over to the bulletin board, where photos and documents were scattered around, all interconnected by red lines and markers. He was putting together a plan that would expose the truth behind Officer Tom and break down any resistance that might appear. He knew that the power of the FBI was not something to be underestimated, and that he had the resources to get it exposed, no matter how high up the cop was. It was a game of patience, but now Mark had all the pieces in place. He picked up a photo of Tom that was pinned to the board and looked at it for a few seconds. The policeman seemed so insignificant there, but in those seconds, Mark felt a sense of justice begin to take shape. He was determined to see this case through. He knew that Tom's story went deeper than anyone could have imagined, and he was ready to reveal the whole truth. "Let's do it," Mark muttered to himself, with a bitter smile on his face. He knew that his decision could have repercussions for all his work at the FBI, but he didn't care. Nothing else mattered. The only thing he needed now was to make sure that Sarah was heard, that the truth was revealed. He was going to expose Tom, but not just as a corrupt cop. He was going to show what was behind the curtains, where the real power figures were involved, and how a simple assault could set off a chain of events that would transform the lives of everyone involved. Sarah didn't say anything, but she could feel the tension growing in the room. She knew that her father was about to enter a dangerous field. Mark was willing to risk his own career and possibly the safety of his family to ensure that the truth was exposed. This wasn't something she'd ever seen before, but deep down she knew he couldn't act any other way. He had always done what he thought was right, even if it meant putting everything he had built at risk. When Mark finally made the call, his voice was firm and uncompromising. He spoke with an authority that no one could dispute, and in a matter of minutes, Tom's fate was sealed. The plan was in motion, and now there was no turning back. Every word he said was like a death sentence for the policeman's career. Meanwhile, Tom was in his car, trying to digest what had happened. He knew something was about to happen, but he still couldn't understand how far Mark was willing to go. He had underestimated this man, and now he was paying the price. Fear began to invade his chest. Not because he was guilty of the assault that he knew he could explain, but because he knew there was something more. Something much bigger and more dangerous was lurking. The key moment came when the first wave of discoveries about Tom's past began to emerge. Mark had done his homework, and everything he needed was now in his hands. He had known from the start that Tom was not just any policeman, but a man with dark secrets. The policeman wasn't just involved in petty corruption activities, but was linked to a larger network of influence peddling, a network that stretched all the way to the upper echelons of government. Mark knew that this would make Tom an easy target for any move he wanted to make. Tom, unaware of what was going on, saw his life turned upside down when the truth began to leak out. Confidential documents were leaked, and his participation in corruption schemes was exposed. But the most devastating thing for him was not being caught up in illegal activities. It was the moment he realized that the man he had assaulted Sarah's father had immense influence and was about to bring down everything he had built. Mark, with his implacable calm, had used everything he knew to put Tom in a position where there was no escape. The climax of the story was not just Tom's downfall, but Mark's redemption. He had put the truth above all else, above his career, above any loyalties, and above what he could personally lose. Justice was no longer just a question of laws and regulations. It was a question of doing what was right, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Mark knew that he had done the right thing, that Sarah would finally receive the peace she deserved, even if the battle was still far from over. When the phone rang again, Mark looked at Sarah, who was watching him with an expression of mutual understanding. He picked up, and the voice on the other end was clear. The job is done. But for Mark, the job would never truly be done until he saw Tom face the consequences of his actions, until the truth was fully exposed and Sarah was free of any fear that this man represented. Tom's downfall was more than just an outcome of justice. It was the turning point that changed the course of life for everyone involved. Mark not only exposed the policeman's crimes, but also dismantled a network of corruption that ran deep within society. The FBI finally managed not only to deliver the punishment Tom deserved, but also to cut the roots of a rotten system that had infiltrated various institutions of power. For Mark, the mission wasn't just about revenge. It was about a commitment to the principles he had sworn to uphold, even if it meant losing everything. He knew that his work would never be the same, that personal consequences would come, but deep down he was sure that he had done the right thing. For Sarah, the weight of injustice had finally been lifted from her shoulders, not just because of the action her father took, but because of the clarity of knowing that, even in the face of the deepest despair, there is still a chance to put right what is wrong in the world. The impact of his courage and his father's sacrifice would resonate for generations, reminding everyone that the truth, no matter how painful, will always prevail. In the end, Mark sat back in his chair, exhausted but at peace, knowing that, however difficult the journey, he had restored not only his daughter's dignity, but also that of many others whose voices had been drowned out. Just for those who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching. And there's one more thing. Parents make their child sleep in the backyard for weeks. When neighbors realize why, they call the police. That's the subject of the next video I've pinned to the screen. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.